Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Heather, and I'm on the marketing team here at Eli Networks. Today's webinar is part of our three-part series titled Security Resilience, Thriving in an Unpredictable Atmosphere. And today's topic is how to leverage thermal cameras for your business. Before we get started, we have the usual housekeeping. If you have any questions throughout, please type them in the Q&A box at any time, and we'll address them at the end of the webinar. This webinar is being recorded, and all registrants will receive a follow-up email with a link to the full recording after the webinar. Now I will introduce your speaker for today. Hans Kahler is Vice President of Operations and Business Development at Eli Networks. In this role, he is responsible for product management, strategic accounts, technology partnerships, and business development. He has been with Eli Networks for over 6 years. And he's here today to go more in depth on this topic.
Thanks, Heather. I appreciate that. So this is just real quick about Eagle Eye. I think most of you probably know this, so I'll go through it really quickly. We were founded in 2012. We are currently the leader in cloud video surveillance. Our headquarters is in Austin, Texas, which is where Heather and I are coming from. We also have offices in Tokyo and Amsterdam, and we currently have customers in over 80 countries. So we're not going to spend a ton of time about that, but just want to give the quick little intro of who we are, and then a couple of other accolades here. The one that I like to talk about the most is the one in the middle, the Deloitte Fast 500. This was last year. We were rated number 133 of all companies in North America and number 1 in video surveillance as far as fastest growing companies. So just want to throw those things out there, but let's get to it. Here's the agenda that we're going to go over. There's a lot of talk about thermal cameras. So, and the FDA, FDA recently released some new guidelines within about the last 30 days. So we're going to go over that pretty quickly. Then we're going to go over thermal cameras, a little bit of differences between them. And we're going to talk about what we're seeing in the market. This is, there's certainly some theoretical stuff, but we're seeing people actually using these now. I did a webinar about, I don't know, a month, maybe 6 weeks ago, when things first started getting interesting with the thermal cameras. And since then, we have some actual use cases. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. And we're going to talk about how we've integrated the temperature monitoring into Eagle Eye. And then we're going to stop and take some questions and answers. So just a quick run through of the agenda. Before we do that, we've got the legalese here. So, the reality, you can read that. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. Bottom line is that diagnosing someone with elevated body temperature or higher skin temperature doesn't mean they're necessarily sick. I think we all know that. Also, that somebody can be sick and not have a higher temperature. So it's an important part. This is a piece of screening for keeping your employees, your customers, your constituents, whoever it is, safe. This is not the entire solution. It's a piece of an overall solution. So we'll talk about what that means as we go along a little bit further. So the FDA guidelines. This is not an exact verbatim reading of the guidelines. These are pieces that we've pulled out that we think are interesting. You can get these all on the FDA's website, but we're just going to go through some of the highlights. So the equipment, the cameras, should be accurate to plus or minus 0.9 degrees Fahrenheit. If anybody's coming in from outside the U.S., I don't know what that equates to in Celsius, but I'm sure there is an equivalent in Celsius. The equipment should use a black body calibration unit. We're going to talk about that a little bit, but essentially what a black body is it's a device that emits a constant temperature and is a point of reference for the camera. That anybody that is screened that has an elevated body temperature should have that reading confirmed with a secondary device. In other words, if a camera sees that somebody has an elevated body temperature, then they should be sent to some other evaluation with an actual thermometer, either the forehead or whatever the preferred thermometer is for evaluating people. Also, the FDA suggests measuring one subject at a time. There's a lot of marketing out there of cameras that can do multiple subjects at a time. I've seen 20, I've seen 30, seen a whole room full of people, and that might be possible, but the FDA recommends one at a time. Also, now these are some of the newer things. The first 4 bullets were from their original guidelines that came out in about April, I think. Now they've added to that, and they've added some clarity about what the room temperature should be. That the room temperature where the person is being measured should be between 68 and 76 degrees and a fairly low relative humidity. Kind of makes sense. You don't want somebody in a 98-degree room getting their temperature measured, but this also means it should be indoors. Outdoor, there's people that are talking about, oh, well, we'll just put one out in the parking lot and people can get checked before they come in the building. It doesn't work out that way so well. Also, avoid reflective backgrounds. We've actually seen some of this in our own testing here at our office in Austin, that we put it by the front door of our building, which is not recommended, but that's where we started out doing this. And we see that the glass reflects a lot of different things. Doesn't only reflect light, it also reflects heat. So makes a big difference. So you want to make sure that you try to avoid the glass. And then the last one is, again, these are from the FDA, use in a room with no draft. That's also out of direct sunlight, or portable heaters, air conditioning, vents, those kinds of things. So you want to make sure that this is an area where the air is not flowing. And it's not so much about the airflow, it's about change of temperature. So mainly air conditioners, heaters, that kind of thing. So that's the guidelines from the FDA. Again, the document itself, I think, is more like 12 pages, but these are the highlights that we pulled out of there. So let's talk about how thermal cameras work. So essentially, the thermal cameras work by reading the infrared spectrum. Regular cameras read visible light spectrum, which is just a different wavelength than infrared. So the picture here on the left is what people generally think about when they think of thermal cameras. This is, it's actually me carrying groceries in from my Jeep, but you can see the wheel on the Jeep's really hot. That's from the brakes. The engine compartment's really hot. I'm wearing shorts. You can see the different color in my leg versus where the shorts are, same in the arms and the short sleeve shirt. And when people think of thermal cameras prior to all this COVID stuff and prior to the mass media attention, they generally thought of something that looked along these lines. And that's what thermal cameras had been historically deployed to do, is to detect people and vehicles at a perimeter. That's why I actually have this one on my driveway. I've had that hung up there for quite a while, just as we were working with thermal cameras in general before elevated body temperature came about. And in that instance, the specific temperature is not super important here. You know, you can tell that that's a Jeep, or at least a vehicle. You can tell that that's a person. Whether the temperature of my body at that point is 98.6 or 98.9, nobody really cares. But you can see there's a person, and that works great for perimeter protection. What we're looking at here on the right, this is generally more of what an elevated body temperature camera looks like. You can see there's a lot more detail in the shades. You can make out wrinkles in the shirt. This one isn't me. This is one of our engineers. And then up here above his head, there's that little square area. That is the black body. So essentially, the camera is using this black body to compare the temperatures around it with. So you could put this in different colors, although grayscale seems to be the best for picking out what's going on. But you can also apply different themes, they call it, to make it colored similar to the purples and reds and yellows and oranges that are over on the left side. But you know, here where you're seeing on the left side, you can't really make out my face. You just see that there's a head there. Well, on this picture on the right, you can see there's a nose, although the box around the forehead covers up some stuff. But you can see a mouth, you can see a chin. You know, you can see his sleeves are rolled up. Much greater resolution, much more definition there, and also much greater accuracy in reading the temperature. So that's something I think that's important to people, that people sometimes don't necessarily think all the way through, is that you really want to know what kind of a camera you're using and what's the margin of error for the temperature. Most of the cameras used for perimeter protection are about 5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. That's way more than what the FDA suggests. The FDA suggested or recommends less than 1 degree Fahrenheit of margin of error or of accuracy for the thermal cameras. And you know, generally, most of the cameras that are being marketed for body temperature generally fall under that 1 degree Fahrenheit range, but not all of them do. So that's something to check out as you're looking at different cameras. So here's the components. Now these are for elevated body temperature screening. So there's the thermal spectrum, there's the visible spectrum. So this is just, again, this isn't a camera that we used for elevated body temperature, but it's just one where we could show that there's actually two lenses here real easily. You can see the thermal image and the visible image. In this case, you'll notice that they're actually different resolutions. And that's fairly common with a lot of thermal cameras, that the thermal image is not as high of a resolution as the visible image. So I think I might be a little bit wrong here, but in this particular example, that it's a 1 megapixel on the thermal and a 2 or 3 megapixel on the visible spectrum, which sometimes is okay, sometimes it doesn't matter. Then there's the black body. So the black body, you saw the picture in the thermal cameras. This is what one looks like in real life. There's a lot of different versions of these. There's a lot of development happening in this area. Generally, the only time people in the security industry had heard of a black body was if they were doing fire inspections. You can use a black body to also calibrate your temperature gun that you'd use when you're doing fire inspection, or making sure that temperatures, or HVAC folks would use this to calibrate their temperature guns as they're measuring the different HVAC components in buildings. But essentially, you set this to a predetermined temperature, and it emits that temperature, and then you can calibrate your equipment, whether it's a fixed camera like what we're talking about here, or a handheld camera or handheld temperature gun. You can use those black bodies to calibrate those different pieces of equipment. And so when you're using this with elevated body temperature screening, it's got to be in the field of view of the camera. So usually mounted in above the door where people are walking in is what's usually recommended, but different manufacturers have different recommendations. We had to record the video. So obviously we're Eagle Eye, we're talking about our bridge. So we're going to talk about us. So an on-site appliance, this is our Model 304. We have a lot of different bridges. Doesn't matter which one as far as this scenario goes. And then the local display, which just is optional, but I generally recommend it for the thermal cameras. It allows people to see what's going on as they walk in. Local displays are very common in video surveillance, especially in retail stores. I remember when I was a kid, I'd walk into a 7-Eleven or something like that, and I was all excited I was on TV. Same concept. This can give you immediate feedback for people that are walking in if they have elevated temperature or not. So let's talk about how this is being applied right now. So one thing that when I talk with folks about video surveillance, that one video surveillance camera or one video surveillance installation can solve a lot of different problems for your business. Forget about thermal for a second. But if you're a retail store, you can put surveillance cameras up and help reduce theft. You can also help catch shoplifters that are in the process. That cameras didn't deter them, you can catch them. You can also use them for things like evaluating if your store is neat and tidy, or if employees are opening the store on time. And so you can use that one solution, that video surveillance solution, to solve lots of problems. Well, I think thermal is similar, slightly different, but similar. And that, the fact you're using the camera to check somebody's temperature, we're seeing businesses apply it for different reasons. So let's roll through some of those here. So airports, I think this is one where a lot of people have expected this. In fact, some airports, especially in Europe, were doing this already. In certain cases, I was in London last year, and there was a trial of this going on long before COVID-19 had even been heard of. So airports make a lot of sense, international passengers coming into the country, et cetera. But where we're seeing this happen, and where some of our customers are implementing this, is for the employees, the ticketing agents, the TSA employees, the gate agents, the folks at the airport that work the concessions. And this is actually a really good environment to deploy thermal cameras, because if you go back to those FDA guidelines, an airport scenario meets, I think, all of them, because you can put this in a separate area away from the entrance, so especially for the employees. So as employees come into work, they go to the screening room, which is maybe, it's definitely inside the airport somewhere. So they get a chance to get acclimated to whatever the temperature of the building is, at 68 to 72 degrees or 76 degrees Fahrenheit. So they're not walking in right out of the sun. They can control the airflow very easily. They can control lighting. They can control windows. So airports make a ton of sense. Obviously, there's a small number of airports out there, but this is an area where screening the employees is happening, and sometimes it's happening during their shifts. We definitely know it's happening when they come in. We're talking to folks who are saying they want people to come back in halfway through their shift, like on their lunch break and before they return back to work, to get screened again, because it can happen pretty quickly. So, obvious place, great use case, but obviously not everybody represents an airport. Not everybody can install stuff in an airport, but it's a place where things work really well. We're also seeing a lot of stuff in food distribution, whether this is warehousing or the distribution or the food production. So places where they're doing, not necessarily the meat packing plants. I think they're a little bit more rigorous there, but places where they're moving from, like I said, distribution, taking off this truck, putting on that truck, or packaging stuff. So we've seen it with, again, not necessarily the meats. I'm sure something's happening there. We haven't personally seen that, but we've seen it where with produce, for example. And so the concern here is, again, they're scanning employees. But one of the things, I talked to the legal counsel of one company, and they were saying that they need to have some proof that they're doing things, that they're being proactive in trying to prevent sick employees from coming to work, and because they're afraid of essentially lawsuits. So they're putting this in place so that if they do get sued, they can say, look at all this video. We've been scanning everybody, and this person had a higher temperature and we pulled them out. So that they're already thinking about how to protect themselves from potential lawsuits. So they're not only scanning to be safe, but then this is also, again, one solution solving multiple problems, providing them the backup they need for any potential lawsuits. Logistics companies. This is similar to the food distribution, but we're also seeing this in logistics companies where a lot of packages come in and out, and employees are maybe reluctant or scared, or whatever the right term is, to come back to work because stuff's coming in from overseas, stuff's coming in from across state lines. And so they have a lot of concerns of if anybody is going to get sick. So the employees are asking for thermal scanning in order to feel safe to come back to work. This is something we've actually talked to 2 different logistics companies about this, where again, it's not the management team, it's the employees that are asking for it. So interesting little spin on it there. And then everything I talked about so far was employees, but we're also talking to quite a few different co-working spaces. And co-working spaces, they make their money by people coming in and using the space. Some of them are on a monthly basis, some of them have a little bit longer agreements, some of them are weekly, or some of them even have day use fees for things like, you want to use a conference room for a day, you can come in and rent a conference room for a day. Well, this is the only group we've talked to that is actually wanting to scan their customers. Now, it's a little different because they kind of act like employees. It's not scanning customers in the same sense of scanning everybody in a shopping mall or scanning people as they go to a movie theater. It's not scanning the consumer type of customers, but for co-working spaces and for their customers who are officing there to have a good, safe feeling, they're exploring thermal cameras. Now, a lot of them are, we've actually deployed a couple. A lot of them are still early talking because they're not necessarily opening back up, but they're wanting to get ready. And so different cities are seeing different kinds of things. We actually have a demo of this in a co-working space. Capital Factory here in Austin, Texas is where we have our general demo site. And so we're doing a demo of the thermal cameras there as well. We're featured on the local news. We can get you guys a link for that. But essentially, it's the same setup that we've got in the lobby of our building and that we're putting in for other customers, that it's making people feel a lot safer going in and going back to work, even though it's at a building where they don't own it or rent out the whole building. They just rent out a cubicle or a small conference room or whatever it is. All right, so how does this work? So I'm assuming you guys are somewhat familiar with Eagle Eye. If you're not, let us know. We'll be glad to give you a full demo of the overall solution. But at a high level, Eagle Eye, for visual spectrum cameras, the video goes into the bridge. I mentioned we have a bridge. The bridge does some stuff here. It has a local hard drive. It can buffer the video, does some basic analytics stuff, and then it sends the video to the cloud. And from the cloud, it can go to your laptop, your iPad, your iPhone. Of course, works with Android. We work with Mac, Windows, all modern browsers. So that's how our system works in general. But when we add the thermal side to it, it's very similar, but there's a couple of different things. So thermal video comes in. So we capture the thermal video. That's the stuff that looks like the Predator or, the black and white grayscale stuff. But we also capture the temperature data from the camera. Now, different cameras have different capabilities. I got a chart here in a minute or two that will show you some of them. But most of the thermal cameras are providing some level of temperature data. And so it's not just the video, but it's also this particular subject has a temperature of 97.2. I think it was 97.3, whatever the temperature is that's being read. And so what we're doing with that is we're capturing that data and independently of the video and being able to make decisions based on that. So some of the decisions could be, if it's over a certain temperature, send an alert. Who do you send the alert to? There's some questions there that the business needs to answer, and there's got to be a process in place for if somebody does have that elevated temperature. But we've captured that data, and now we can send an alert. We could also search the video. So again, talking to back to one of those use cases where I was saying at the food distribution facility, the lawyers were asking, hey, can you easily show me at the end of the week everybody that came through that had an elevated temperature, or do some kind of counts of we had X number of temperatures read and Y number was over a threshold and Z number was under a threshold? Yes, we can't. We don't have that feature right this minute, but that's the next thing we're working on, is the reporting on that and then linking to the associated video. So really, by storing that data independently of the video, we can do a lot of ways of slicing and dicing it. And again, we're just taking what comes off the camera. Different cameras have different levels of accuracy. So people say, hey, I like this camera or I like that camera. With our visual spectrum, or the traditional cameras, we support 4,000 different models of cameras. And we're looking to support a wide range of thermal cameras as well. So as different manufacturers improve their camera, or as placement gets better, as things get better, we're collecting the data, and then we're acting, or we're sending alerts or reports based on that and allowing business owners and users to react accordingly. The other thing that we add a lot of times for thermal cameras is the local display. Again, I mentioned this is optional, and it works with visual spectrum cameras as well, although we don't see as many customers deploying that. But we really recommend it with the thermal setup, and it plugs directly into the bridge. We can also work it some other ways, but the easiest way is just to run an HDMI cable, plug it right into the bridge. You get real-time video. Everybody sees exactly what's going on. But all that video and data, thermal video, visual video, it's all available through your iPad, your laptop, wherever you are. So if you just look at the left part of the screen, the visual spectrum, the bridge, and the local display, that's what most solutions out on the market are providing, is something that you have to have an attendant sitting there watching this in real time, because it's all a closed system. And we can work generally in that way. The bridge has to connect to the internet, but you could still have somebody sitting there and watching the video in real time. But what we add with the power of the cloud is the ability to have that data available elsewhere. Again, the food distribution, they were worried about monitoring their managers at the plants to make sure that their managers were actually pulling people out of the workforce if they had an elevated temperature. People are wanting to get back to work, and I don't blame them. But if they have a high temperature, they shouldn't be working around food. And so the legal team wanted to be able to review at a central location. These folks had dozens of food distribution facilities, so they didn't want to have to go to each facility at the end of every week and review to make sure that each manager did their job. They wanted to sit centrally and pull all that video, making sure that process was being followed. So compliance is something that we can really enable with the cloud, watching the watchers, so to speak. And it's very powerful. And again, that works whether you're doing thermal or regular video, but it's especially interesting with the thermal right now. So here's the camera support that I mentioned. We do have thermal camera that we're selling, and we support the thermal camera and the visual spectrum. And we also have the temperature support. The Sanel, they're kind of famous with their Panda Cam. They made a lot of headlines. Their camera looks kind of like a panda bear, and it's a Chinese company. They were originally deployed in a lot of the schools, and they had it look like a panda bear so the kids would look at it and not be afraid or worried, and kind of caught a little bit of a cult following. So we support that. Dahua Hike Vision, we are supporting all their thermal cameras as far as the visual spectrum and the thermal visual and thermal spectrum. We're working on the support for alerts. We're working with these guys on their firmware. There's been a little bit of an interesting thing that we've seen with almost every manufacturer we've talked to, is that there's something weird about how they send data out. Some of it, the timestamp's off. Some of it doesn't identify the subject correctly. So for example, and I'll leave the names out of it to protect the innocent and the guilty here, but we were talking to one camera manufacturer who said, yeah, we can give you the temperature data. We said, great, send us a camera. So we got the camera, we got it working. And then instead of sending us the temperature, they just said high or low. And so we didn't know what the temperature was to be able to do anything else other than high or low. And you had to set that at the camera. So if you needed to adjust it or whatever, you had to go back to the camera. It was a real pain. So we're working with them, and I think we've got it to where we're getting the temperature. Now they would show it on the screen. They would show on the screen the actual temperature, but what they sent us through their API was not what they showed on the screen. So we're getting there. The one that a lot of people ask about is FLIR. They're probably the Cadillac of thermal cameras. They've been doing it a long time, and we're working with them with their A400 and their A700 series cameras. The problem is those are sold out for weeks or months, so we're having a hard time getting a hold of one. We've talked with their team. We've looked at the specifications. We believe that it's possible with those two models. However, we haven't done it yet. So if anybody's got one that they're willing to share, let me know. But bottom line is we think we can make it work once those models become more available. And by the way, for those that don't know, they were just released, I think, at the end of May, beginning of June timeframe. And they were already back ordered for 8 to 12 weeks when they were released. All the ones that were in the initial batch were sold before they were even available. So you take the camera, whether you use the Eagle Eye camera, the Sanel, Hike Vision, Dahua, Mobotics, or eventually the FLIR or something else that we're adding. We're getting requests for new models all the time. There's obviously the benefits we talked about for thermal, but I think I'm going to talk about some of the benefits of our cloud VMS coupled with thermal, because I think a few of these features make this a very powerful solution. I talked about a few of them already, but whoops, I clicked the wrong thing. But cybersecurity. A lot of these cameras, people might have some questions about the cybersecurity of the manufacturer. And so with Eagle Eye, we can actually isolate that camera from the internet, providing an extra layer of cybersecurity. Also, simplified setup. I don't know if anybody set some of these cameras up, but they're not always the easiest thing. There's a lot of different gizmos and gadgets that you have to go in and put in. And some of those we just have to deal with. Like, for example, you have to measure the angle that the camera is pointed down at and enter that into one of the settings. You have to measure the camera from the distance from the camera to the screening area. And they recommend, by the way, somewhere about 10 to 15 feet away. So you don't want to be right under the camera. You want to have some distance there. And again, different manufacturers have different recommendations. These are all things that you have to enter into the camera, but then you've got to manage the alerts. And that's where it gets really tricky. Because if you want to have an alert from a camera, you've got to configure it to a mail server. You've got to configure it to some other kind of vehicle that can send out those alerts. We eliminate that step. We can't get around the configuration of the setup of the camera as far as the physical attributes of it, but from storing the video, sending the alerts, it's super easy. I'm going to show you a screen here in a second on how that works. We've got the local display, which works really well with, we talked about that. Low bandwidth mode. One of the things that people think about when they think of Eagle Eye and they think of cloud video surveillance is they think, geez, I got to have a lot of bandwidth. Well, actually, we've got a low bandwidth mode where we can store the video locally and just send out clips that people are interested in. We can still send alerts even though the video is being stored locally. And so low bandwidth mode works really well here. We use this generally when we're talking outside of thermal cameras. We got a lot of customers in oil and gas and property management that have remote sites that don't have internet at all. And so they hook up with a cellular modem, like something from Cradlepoint, for example. And so that video can be stored locally, but again, because we can evaluate stuff there at the bridge, we can send alerts, and then people can say, oh, this is something I'm interested in. So a non-thermal example is motion, really simple example. If you're out at an oil well and there's motion at a gate, you might want to send an alert. Someone can look at that and go, oh, it's a maintenance guy, or oh no, that's a problem. And then they can pull the video that they really want to see. Same thing with the thermal. We can actually get the temperature data and decide whether or not to send an alert. And if somebody does get the alert, they can then decide if they want to pull the video. So very low bandwidth utilization there. The remote access to the video and the data. This is just something that's very ingrained in our DNA. That's how we work from the beginning, but it's, again, especially important here, especially for people that want to deal with compliance and make sure that the local folks are doing things correctly. Archiving. This is a feature we released about 6 or 8 weeks ago. It's been in beta for quite a while, so some of you might be aware of it. But essentially what we can do is we can store your video in the cloud for longer than your normal retention. And what I mean by that is, let's say you're storing all your video 30 days. And then, again, a non-thermal thing, somebody steals from you. And you've got that clip. You want to store that longer. You want to, say, maybe store it for a year. Well, now you can archive that and decide how long you want to store it. And additionally, you can share that clip with third parties. So you could share that, again, the theft, with the police, with your insurance company, with whatever. In this case, you might want to archive somebody with a high temperature and store that in case there's, like I said, the lawsuit, or share it with HR or whatever needs to be done there. We also have our audit trail. This has been around for a while, but it's not something people generally use. It can measure, or not measure, but records everything from settings changes to use of the system. So you can see if people are actually watching the video that they say they're watching. We also integrate with BRIVO, our sister company, which does access control. There's a lot of thoughts there. You should check out BRIVO if you're interested in that. And then also our API. So our whole system has all this data available via the API, and you can integrate it into other things. So last couple of slides here. I mentioned the simplified setup. You can just put the name of the camera, the name of the alert, so front entry, thermal alert, whatever the temperature threshold is. This one's in Celsius. I told you we do have Celsius available as well, but obviously whatever temperature you want to alert at. Who, you can choose multiple people, multiple users. And then we can also say when. This one's 24 hours. This is our exact same alert that we set up for motion detection or line crossing or camera tampering or any other analytics that we have. So you could maybe choose to just only do this during business hours, etc. So really just straightforward, just a few clicks, and that's all you really need to do. And then the alerts look like this. Apologize for the background here. This was my product manager's phone that we're doing. So you get a push notification, and you can kind of see a quick image. Clicking on that brings you up to here, so you can see the actually who it was, and you can see what the temperature was. Now this one is green because we've got the alert threshold set a little high, but at any rate, you can see it'd also be green or red. So I know I'm getting to the end of the time here, so I'll go through this real quick. Lots of camera support at Eagle Eye. We have analytics that run in the cloud or on the bridge. So regardless of your camera, we can use analytics there. Our API that I mentioned allows you to get that data, get that video in and out of lots of different systems. And then a lot of cybersecurity, privacy concerns, or a lot of tools to address privacy concerns as well that are available for everybody, regardless if this is thermal or visual spectrum. So I mentioned BRIVO is our sister company. They do access control. If you're not familiar with them, please check them out. They've been doing cloud since before cloud was cool, so to speak. They've been 20 years. Their access control platform has 20 million users. One platform with 20 million users. Just amazing. And then the other thing that's kind of interesting that I just want to throw out there is we have another sister company that a lot of people might not know about, and it's Swift Sensors. And Swift Sensors, we're also integrated with Swift Sensors. They have a lot of different kinds, I think 40 or 50 different wireless sensors that allow you to read environmental conditions. So things like vibration, humidity, temperature, moisture. They've got one to detect the presence of ammonia, and essentially those sensors can then send an alerts. And by the way, they're integrated with video. It's kind of hard to see on the screenshot here, but if there's an alert that goes off and there's a sensor associated with a camera, the eagle eye video can be shown so you can see what's causing that alert. So with that, let me stop, see if there's any questions. I think you guys have been entering them in the chat. Heather, are you there? Is there any questions that have come up?
Yes, thanks, Hans. Let's transition to the Q&A part now. If anybody else in the audience does have any more questions, now would be the time to type them in the Q&A box of Zoom. So I'll start with the first few. The first one we have here is, could you elaborate on how your solution combines logistically with warehouse management processes? Or if you could give any examples of how we've worked with warehouse management processes so far.
Sure. So the warehouses that we've worked with so far have largely been concerned with getting their employees back to work in the warehouses. And so what they've done is they've installed thermal cameras that they're reading the temperature of employees as they come in to work. And they have a couple of different entrances where they're guiding folks to come through. And what they've actually had to do is they had more, it used to be you could just walk through the big doors where the trucks pull in. And so they've had to direct employees to walk through kind of the main office, so to speak, and not go to the warehouse first. And they have a hallway that is actually really well suited in their particular floor plan. They originally were wanting to install these in the vestibule in the main entrance, and this company's situation, that just wasn't realistic. It was a glass box essentially that was had double doors and then about 5-6 feet of space and then another set of double doors. I think we've all gone through that kind of vestibule in our lives. And that's where they had thought they wanted to install them, but they realized with FDA guidance, manufacturer guidance, that they had to put it somewhere else. They actually have a side entrance that goes into a long hallway that was much better. So they have the employees going through there, and then there's another one that they have as well. So they installed a couple of these thermal cameras to make sure that their employees are at the not elevated temperature. And then what they're doing is sending the alerts to the site manager if there are any. So that's how that works there. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yes, it does, definitely. So for specifics on camera integration, do we integrate with thermal cameras, and where can people go to find out which cameras we are compatible with right now?
So thermal cameras, here's a list at a high level of manufacturers. EEN.com/cameras. We'll have the complete list on the models. There's a couple of models from Dawa, a couple of models from Hikvision. There's only one. Well, actually, Sonel has just released another model that we have en route. They say it's the same software. It's a little less expensive. So we're working to get the second version of the Sonel camera integrated, or second model. So right now we're a little behind in updating the website, just as we're trying to get everything going. But one day, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, we had a request for 5 different models from Hikvision actually that came in the same day. Not 5 requests for the same camera, same model, but 5 different models from different customers all around the world. So it's rapidly changing. The bottom line is that at a high level, they need to support OnVIF, which is just a regular thing for all of the cameras that are connected to Eagle Eye. So OnVIF Profile S. And if they support that, there's a really good chance we'll be able to work with them.
All right. Well, it looks like that's all the questions we can cover for now.
Okay.
But if for those of you that have any more remaining specific questions, you can reach out to us. If we could go to our last slide here, you'll see all our contact information, as well as after this webinar, you'll be receiving the recording and also follow-up information on the topic of thermal cameras. So thank you, Hans, for presenting today, and thank you everyone for being here.
Thanks, Heather.